Thanks, Vish, and thanks to the speakers of the previous session. Not going to waste any time and just confirm that each speaker has 15 minutes to speak. Michelle and Awande, I'm going to do my best to try and signal to you somehow when you have 5 minutes remaining so that we can stick to time. And a reminder to everyone that the session that we are currently in is going to be reflecting on democratizing parties and market democracies. And Michelle's going to talk about reflections on mechanisms and practices, and Awande on the Political Party Funding Act, as well as running individual candidates for SA Parliament, which I think would be very helpful. So Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, William. Okay, so I just have a disclaimer to start with, and that's that these are very kind of speculative ideas, comments that I'm having. So there's more concerns, questions that I've been having and I'm articulating to Vish, and then Vish put me down to speak on it. So normally I'd like to have something more worked out when I speak, and this is really just a kind of a journey. So I want to have that up front. And given that it's about trying to get my head around these topics, I decided I wanted to also talk about some of what I think are the problems with parties, and then get into maybe some ideas around what we need to rethink, ways we can rethink this. The first thing I think we should talk about or understand is that parties across the world are in crisis. And so it's not unique to any political context. What you're seeing all over the place is that parties are in crisis. And that's why, like Sunny's statement earlier, the old is anachronistic and needs to be thrown away. It's because I think that many people feel that the political parties of the 20th century have run aground and that we need something new. And we have some new experiments, which I'm very excited that Mario's going to speak later about Syriza, Podemos, and the Left Party, which are some of the exciting experiments in reconfiguring political parties. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that we recognize there's something that is about parties being in crisis all over the world. And Vish covered some of the broader context that affect parties globally. But I just want to say a few more things about some of the challenges and problems that I think parties face, or that create conditions in which parties must operate. First of all, I think one of the big problems, and this gets to the issue of inequality, but the capitalist pie is not infinite; it is finite. So it isn't like it is a zero-sum game to a point that not all benefit equally, and in many cases, many don't benefit at all. And so that creates all of these severe perversities of credible poverty alongside enormous wealth. You have these inequalities and all sorts of felt and real deprivations. And that's just inherent to the capitalist system. And then I want to say, just also, yeah? Oh, okay, sorry. And then neoliberal capitalism, as we mentioned before, I think it really has hollowed out a lot of the democratic practices, ethos, but a lot of also policies and legislation. And one of the ways we see this is corporations really being able to push their interests, whether it's the pharmaceuticals or the kind of oil industry or the Monsanto, in all these big spheres, or finance capital at this point. These big spheres, corporate interests have enormous power. And I think this has affected political parties in very profound ways. I mean, one is that they get affected by funding. There's also this revolving door of political, and more so in some places than others, but people in political positions and get co-opted onto boards and positions within corporations. There's also co-optation, there's corruption, but I also think one of the things that we've suffered through over the last 100 years, but especially in the last 40 years, is the ideological paradigm that neoliberalism has really pushed. And so many people, I think, don't even imagine a world beyond capitalist relations, certainly in market relations. So the role of the state in this has been important, and I think that parties have operated within this. So I think this is one of the big challenges, or I said that's two. Capitalist pie isn't growing. There's also the ways in which neoliberal capitalism has actually shaped the conditions in which parties operate. Second, I think the challenge is just at the level of the political system itself, all over. And this is that we in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century especially, democracy and political parties had basically narrowed our understanding of the political system to a narrow electoralism. And this basically concentrates power in party machines, but it also concentrates power within the elites, within parties, and gives capital, corporations, an enormous amount of leverage. It also produces passive citizens. So we see our role, our democratic role, as voting for our parties. And so the political system has many problems just on the level of the way in which it's organizing participation and representation. Secondly, or third, fourthly, I don't know, my numbers are crazy. Wherever I am. In addition, there are challenges at the level of political parties themselves. We see factional battles, and I think a lot of the factionalism, I mean, I had a PhD student write a PhD thesis on the collapse of the party and state in the Eastern Cape and Buffalo City. But I think this is not unique to the ANC. What we have is factional battles that relate to leadership, interests, and power. So parties get collapsed, even if we don't acknowledge it entirely, with particular political leaders and their interests. And then they become these avenues, these patronage systems. And political parties also survive through linkages to capital, and this is because capital provides very real funding, and very few places in the world have electoral funding or laws around party funding, and I think it's a really crucial thing. But also just the individual interests. So you see a lot of people on the ground who will align with particular leaders because for them it links to the patronage. It's how they will actually survive and get some kind of benefits from a system that, I mean, in the South African case, when we have unemployment rates that Dish talked about, and we have an unviable economic system, for many people, the only avenue for any kind of livelihood and survival is patronage politics. It's what the state provides in your local community. So then you align to particular leaders because that's your only way to get anything. And then there's a conflation of the party and state. There's this appeal to populism and the conditions of deprivation. Populism is, and we're seeing this all over the world. Inequalities, populism is rife because you appeal to emotions. Populism is about this emotive appeal, and rather than engage kind of reasoned deliberation. So whenever there's big winners and big losers, populism, I think, actually has fertile ground. And then I think there's another thing in which parties both benefit and suffer from, and that is misinformation and false news. There's all sorts of problems with that, which I'll get to in a sec. Okay, and then I think there's also another issue of the way in which parties relate to their bases of support, the ways in which they relate to publics. And Mazibuko's paper talks a little bit about some of this. He uses different language than I'm using, but I think we converge a lot. My experience very often is parties either have antagonistic relationships to the public, they have relations in which they have instrumental, opportunistic relations to the public, where they just call on people to support the parties. And they often have relations of distrust. So rather than parties working with and for people and the publics, they often see themselves kind of separate from and above publics. And I think, again, this can then be populist relations, relying on emotive demands that tap into real deprivation. but they don't offer viable solutions. They offer then these kind of grandiose things that they don't worry about how they ever get put into practice. And I think they also relate, and the way the public then relates often is through a politics of rage and protest, because there's this fundamental delinkage between the parties and the people that they're meant to be representing. So I think that what we see very dominantly all over the world is, rather than a generative politics, and by that I mean a politics in which people are trying to construct alternatives to actually implement real alternative projects, that you see this kind of dominance of just a protest politics. And protest politics doesn't necessarily transform the system. It just rages against something, where the generative would be much more systemic change. That's where you can find systemic change. And then I think another really complicated condition that parties operate on is the way in which capital or large corporations control the media and shape public discourse and shape public interest. And I also think, linked, separate from this, but another huge problem is the role of social media and fake news in public discourse today. And then finally, one of the real issues that I think is a problem is education. Education today, and this is, I think, one of the crises we're seeing at universities. Everybody wants access to education, but it's because education is seen as one of the only avenues or pathways to economic activity. It's your pathway into, ooh, I only have 5 minutes, shucks. Ooh, I better hurry up. Okay, sorry. This is what happens when I just reflect. Okay, so education is basically avenues to economic activity, rather than making people, what you talked about, democratic publics, active citizens. Okay, so then this raises all sorts of questions about, how do parties relate to capital, publics, organizations, civil society, and it also, how do we get parties to then have concrete transformative visions and practices that are really rooted in interest? Okay, so then I had a whole thing about a question about the nature of parties and the nature or capacity of the public. I'm going to skip over all of that. We can talk about it later. And I think I'm just going to get to is that, if parties are such a problem, why do we still look to them? I mean, I think that the answer is, for me, it's very clear. We need parties and organizations because they aggregate interest into these complex political spheres. So I think that that's not the question we should be asking. Rather, is how do we I think we need to both transform systemic, both economic and state relations, but also how do we transform the political party instrument itself? Okay, and I was going to give some examples of Red Vienna and Carola, but I won't. And I think we have to have, there's a few principles, and then I'm not sure how much time I have, but I just have a few ideas around possibilities that I hope you let me get through. So principles, I think we have to think about parties being in synergistic relation to the publics. And I'll talk about how we can maybe think about that. I think we need to re-engage the idea that they reflect the will and interest of publics and peoples. And I had something about how we even define the public, which is a complicated issue that I won't talk about right now. But I think we have to put back into center focus public and common goods, public interest and common goods. So rather than, private car allowances, public transportation, we need to rethink this idea of the public good. And I think we also need to have really important ideas around insistence on ethics and integrity linked to political parties. And then different conceptions of leadership. Okay, so when we redefine parties, I think what we need to think about is, there's just a few ideas I have. So one, as I said, we have to rethink about the role and concept of leadership. So leadership right now is very much linked to power and wealth. You get into leadership positions and you have a great deal of power and wealth. And I think we need to unseat that. Leadership has to be about kind of work and commitment. And maybe then it has to also be about, rotation. I have some ideas based on this one organization that I love in Carola that I can talk about later. But I think we have to really think about the way in which we have leadership, the types of leadership and the way in which we have leaderships. I don't think quotas are enough when we talk about representation. I mean, I think we see that here. South Africa has actually pretty good quotas in terms of gender representation and certainly with race representation in political elected officials, but it hasn't transformed the society, even the gender relations. So I think we also need to think about when we have representation, are those representational kind of subjects really representative? And one of the things that I find interesting right now, for instance, is the Deb Haaland in the home interior in the US. Part of why people are so excited about her is because she actually has support from communities, from real Native American indigenous communities. And so the representational issue is that she is very linked. And it reminds me of the Solidarity Economy Secretariat in Brazil. They got to put who their representative was, not from a club, right? So now I'll say a couple of things very quickly. I think we do need to reintroduce the idea of merit and into these positions, because I think this party deployment, we've seen what that does to our state, but we also see how it then leads to patronage politics. One of the things that I think has been very interesting in the current pandemic is the role of advisory committees, of people who really are experts in a particular field. And I think we need to reintroduce this idea of parties actually having a series of advisory committees that they, on different issues, whether it's land, on these different issues, and people that aren't embedded in the party, so they have no vested interest in that party, but are actually really knowledgeable about the field. And that has to be representation, not just from experts in the university kind of environment, but also, you know, people who actually are on the ground. So both of those. And I think that that's one of the things we can learn from the pandemic, is a way in which the medical sciences have actually really helped the state in this way. Okay, so I think we have to recalibrate the state and elected positions. And I think we also have to weigh up parties through their delivery, you know, and officials really through delivery of what publics want. And I entered the idea of ethics and integrity. Okay, I'm just going to do two more points. Well, I'll be very quick. Thank you. Okay, one is publics. That I think we really need to talk about how do we create democratic citizens through, and I think the education and practicing democracy are crucial, but I think it must start at childhood. I don't think you start later. And I'm thinking about, you know, some of the cooperatives that we have found very exciting around the world actually understand cooperation needs to start at childhood, because everything we do is competitive. You know, you get marks, you're always against everyone else, and completely unseating that means we have to teach children how to actually engage in democratic deliberation. How do you actually not try to get into something to win something, but how do you actually get into something to try to understand it and have the best outcome for the general public? But I think also linked to this, so one is how do we create those, but I think really we have to take very seriously. And there's been political theorists who've written about this kind of stuff, including Hannah Arendt, what I like her conception, which is about if you don't have the economic side and livelihoods worked out, it's very hard to come into a democratic space without your own interests being, you know, also affecting you. So we have to think about meeting the basic conditions of a dignified life that facilitates democratic engagement. And I think the universal basic income grant could be really crucial for this as well, because I think some base survival, people cannot be in such deprivation. Then I think that undermines our capacity to have democratic deliberation. And then I will just quickly say the idea of free and independent media, I think, is really important. You know, there's theories around the fourth estate. It plays a crucial role in keeping the state and corporations, keeping us informed. And this is something we have to take very seriously as well. Okay, I have other smaller comments that I won't give. Sorry, Bill. When I reflect
No worries.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm sorry for rushing you. And I hope you'll be able to bring some of the points you weren't able to look at in the discussion. But for now, I'm going to hand over the floor to Awande for his inputs.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chair. I'm also glad that I went after Michelle, because I feel that her points and her topic kind of complement what I'm going to speak on particularly because I think these two things, the Political Party Funding Act and the Electoral Act amendments, are two things which a lot of people within South Africa, the civil society, and just the populace in general, who've been looking for an alternative to the ANC hegemony and ways in which we can, kind of regain public engagement and participation in our political system, have thought or have seen these two things as the kind of primary means through which we can regain our democracy, quote unquote. And I think that it's great that Michelle said she brought forward the points that she did, because I think that kind of it's a precursor for some of my perspectives around these two new developments, particularly the fact that these developments are happening right on top of each other over the past couple of months. So let me begin. I'll begin with the Political Party Funding Act. So it's important to note that this act was something which was actually first brought forward within Parliament within the Zuma era, most notably by Dr. William Kize and other ANC politicians. And it's taken a very slow road to get to where it is, and for it to arrive to the point where it's about to be enacted now as of April 1st, happened only due to civil society, particularly Corruption Watch, and I'm forgetting the other organization, sorry, I wrote it down, that had pushed the president to finally enact a bill that had been sitting on his table since he entered the presidency. And what does this mean? What does it mean when the Political Party Funding Act is brought into effect on April 1st? So the act regulates the receipt of funding by political parties from three sources, meaning these will be the three main ways in which the funding of political parties will occur. But it's also very important to note that it is not speaking with regards to any party. If we formed a party tomorrow, that we will be subject to this or we will be able to access this funding. Is speaking mainly with regards to what's called, again, parties in the national and provincial legislatures. So the first of the three ways in which political parties will be able to receive, or the funding will be regulated according to, is the first channel is the Represented Political Parties Fund, which will allocate or allocates public funding to parties in the national and provincial legislature based on proportional equitable formula. So under the act, 2/3 of this fund is allocated proportionally based on the results of the previous election, and 1/3 is distributed equitably. I think in terms of who's there and how much each person gets. That's what that equitable aspect means, that there must be an equal share of that final third. And this was also an improvement on the 1997 legislation, where the split was previously 90-10. So 90% of it was based on what the results of the previous election were, then the 10% being the equitable amount. So that obviously significantly favored large parties being, such as the ANC and the DA, historically. Since 1997. The second, what's called again, way in which funding will be facilitated for parties is a kind of new innovation in this funding called the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, which is established to enable private donors to support all the parties using the same formula as the one that I've just spoken about, the RPPF. So this means that in democracies, parties need funding for them to function, and a lot of that funding comes from private donors, and most democracies encourage private donations. But the issue is, the perception of undue influence occurring because of this funding from private donors, but also not just the fear, but the actual occurrence of people being influenced by private donations. So what this Multi-Party Democracy Fund tries to do is that it's going to try to challenge this by encouraging private donors and corporates to contribute to a specific fund that will be overseen by the IEC, which will be responsible for managing this fund, and giving them a greater latitude with regards to how they play their role in monitoring where money goes, who it comes from, and how it's used. And then the third mechanism for funding is private donations from individuals and juristic entities, as they say. And for the first time, the difference is that for the first time, these donations will be under scrutiny in a way in which they never had before. So donations above 100,000 Rand per annum from a single source, was called again, must be disclosed by both the party and the donor. And then this approach also is one which tries to strengthen disclosure practices and donations from single sources by capping them at 15 million per annum. Okay, I'm going to try to move. I didn't think I'd be talking so slow. The Political Party Funding Act is said to be important for three reasons. Well, these are the three main reasons as to how people view its importance, should I say. And one of that is that it's the first obvious one is that it provides us as citizens with the knowledge about private funding of our political parties, and information that the Constitutional Court has declared to be integral to the fulfillment of the right to vote, which I don't think we needed the Institutional Court to inform us on that. I think a lot of us have known for a while that it's a real problem if we don't know who's funding our parties. And I think it's also it says something to the point about what Michelle was speaking about our media, and that in countries such as America and other countries across the world, I think the conversation and the noise around the issue behind, dark money and funding has been something which I think has been less highlighted in South African politics. And I think when it is highlighted, it's subsumed within the wider, what's called again, conversation around corruption, which obviously covers so many grounds that it doesn't leave enough room for this kind of nuanced debate. The second kind of aspect of its importance is the transparency about private funders of political parties will assist in the fight against, corruption, which I think it's not a cure-all, but it's an important step in us being able to take that step forward or that fight forward. And then I'm going to just run through it. And the third one is to enhance the transparency and the cleanup of South African politics, which would give the public more confidence in the politics and democracy in itself. I think that one is actually quite important in the sense that you can see how since Ramaphosa has come into power, the issue of political funding has been kind of used as a kind of weapon within factional battles and political inter-party political battles. So I think once we know these things for ourselves, it can no longer be used as a kind of conspiracy weapon that can be used by political forces to try to bring their opponents down. And then the Constitutional Court's judgment on the Electoral Act and independent parliamentary candidates. So last year, in July 2020, the Constitutional Court's ruling found that the Electoral Act of 1998 was unconstitutional, particularly with regards to the fact that the act requires that adult citizens may be elected to the National Assembly and provincial legislatures only through their political parties. So since that period and now, there hasn't been much movement that has occurred with regards to how that's going to take shape or what that means for how the Electoral Act will be changed. But towards the end of last year, the IEC gave a presentation to Parliament with regards to how they see the bill being drawn up and their thoughts around it, but the responsibility of how it's going to come into effect, those changes will be made, have been given to Parliament, but more specifically the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee within Parliament. And earlier this month, the Home Affairs Minister, Dr. Buthelezi, appointed a ministerial committee to advise on the amendments of the Electoral Act. And their deadline for that work to be done and how it will be revised is June 2022. So next year only will we finally have an understanding of what they're going to produce. And the minister said that the program that this committee will work on was drawn in February, and they've already set out how the matter will be taken forward after a couple of obviously closed door meetings and briefings with the portfolio committee. And this committee is made up of lawyers, political scientists, social scientists, and experts on electoral systems. And just to list the names, some of the people on the committee are Mohammed Vali Musa, Advocate Pansi Tlakula, Advocate Vincent Malek, Dr. Mike Sutcliffe, Dr. Stemi Limbete, and Norman Duplessis, Prof. Daryl Glacier, and Dr. Nomsa Masuku. So there's a number of options with regards to the general direction in which it seems that they will be moving with regards to how they're going to amend the Electoral Act to allow for independent candidates. But the dominant narratives so far out of the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee briefings before this committee was formed, and some of the other conversations with regards to the IEC and Parliament, is that what they are looking at primarily is taking the already existing local government, what's called again mixed system, and elevating that to a national system where basically when you vote, you will vote twice. You'll vote for a candidate and you'll vote for a party. So that's the kind of general trend in which it's moving towards. But admittedly, they say that they are studying different systems from across the world, so it could look different. And on top of that, also, I think it's important now, moving from my description of it, but into my analysis for what it means for a left alternative, is that I think okay, actually, let me do this in order. I'll begin with the Political Funding Act and what it means for a left alternative in South Africa. I think it's a necessary intervention, particularly in the context of our country's ongoing battle with corruption. And as I was saying before, you can see how the issue of political funding has already been used, or is currently being used in the process of pushing forward political battles, the CR17 campaign, with the public protector, the allegations of the DA receiving Israeli funding during the droughts and the Day Zero period, the Guptas and how they've situated themselves within the South African political context, and the EFF's what's called again suggested connections to illegal cigarette smugglers. Also, the question of money within internal party processes, like the ANC elected conferences. I think this act will do lots to push forward greater transparency in those processes, and also do much to also democratize our ability to further scrutinize what happens with our politicians. I think it'll be an equalizer for those in power, but in its current form, it does little for emerging projects, such as one that is this forum is discussing. But what it does promise is that if there were to be a successful campaign putting in candidates from a left alternative, the party would have a better chance of operating along equal footing to other parties in terms of funding. The changes to funding can help in equalizing, but won't fix the 26 years of damage that have already occurred due to our current structure. I see I've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to try to be very succinct in my points about the independent candidates. I do not believe that a left alternative can put its hopes in independent candidates. It would be a liberal approach, and I mean liberal ideologically, such as what Musi Maimane and the One SA movement is trying to do by putting our hopes in individual candidates. I must admit, previously, I was one of the people who felt that maybe this would be a very decisive game changer in how South African politics operates, but a left project cannot be based on individual personalities or individualizing South African politics to reflect places such as America. That's the danger we must watch out for as progressive forces. A left alternative must be rooted in collective power and a collective project. Individuals representing this project would obviously be competent individuals, but they would reflect the will of the people. They would reflect the will of a unified, democratic, and progressive project. Our strength would be reflected in our ability to construct this left-wing political vehicle, not our ability to put individuals in parliament, because we're trying to bring forward a progressive vision for South Africa's future. We're not trying to bring people into parliament just to bring people into parliament. Our ability to move the citizenry further left and generate a new hegemonic consensus matters more than being in parliament if we can't be in parliament and take power. There already exists a societal consensus around a lot of progressive ideals in this country, And what that needs is to be united behind a project that is more holistic and broader. And the ANC's hegemony will not be broken down by individual candidates, if we're being honest. And the South Africa it has created will not be transcended through a collection of individuals. We must also guard against the weakening of the viewpoint that we need a left project due to people thinking that, by putting individuals, we can begin to think that the country, will start moving in the right direction, because if this electoral amendment goes far enough to allow us to even choose candidates on party lists, some people might think that's enough to take our country where it needs to go beyond its current, undemocratic tendencies. But I must say that the positive aspects that I can say about this is that there is an opportunity for this to further democratize South Africa's political parties and make the citizenry more engaged. But there are many countries in the developed and developing world which already have these features and are currently going through their own problems. So it's important for us to remember that. Our country, though, has been sorely lacking in providing a true constituency representation, and I mean that in the geographical sense. The concept of parliament having a constituency engagement period is a farce, in my opinion, considering the fact that no one knows which parliamentarian represents which constituency or how they choose constituencies, or we also don't even have a say with regards to who enters parliament to begin with. And in conclusion, I think it's a step. These two developments are a step forward in the right direction, but it doesn't substitute the work of building an actual left alternative. And a left alternative project which will build a truly post-apartheid South Africa, one which addresses the problem of inequality, the legacy of racialization, and the neo-colonial character of a state where a lot of our people feel alienated from our political structures and institutions. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too over time, Chair.
No, that wasn't bad at all. And thank you very much, Awande.